Okay, so we're going to finish up this lecture now, which is chapter 30 and the rise of new conservatism. So different classes are on different slides, so fast forward if we've already gone over what we're starting with. Okay, so Reagan's style, right? He is going to be so appealing to the American people because he is incredibly charismatic and he is an excellent communicator. And he manages to project this common man style or common man image while still living lavishly, while still being very wealthy. But he promises hope to America again, and that's going to be a really appealing message. He says, we are not doomed to an inevitable decline. Instead, once again, we can become prosperous and can become successful. We just have to work at it, right? Now, keep in mind, this is such an appealing message to people considering what we've seen in the previous 2 decades, right? People feel like there's so much chaos and so much turmoil, and they're so overwhelmed that this is really going to resonate with people. Now, Reagan is also an incredible communicator. He didn't always necessarily know every detail of the issue, as they're incredibly complicated, right? But due to his speaking skills, he was able to sort of reassure the American population, seem like he has a vision and a mission for everything. And this wins him a lot of support, but also a lot of votes. He does very well in televised debates. He does very well on TV. And he inspires confidence in people, right? So he's this very, very popular president. Now, one of the things that's just going to add on to this popularity is we see in America, we sort of rally around presidents if something happens to them, right? So if someone gets shot or something like that, right, the American public, you're going to see a huge spike in support for that president. So unless you're Ford, actually, because Ford had 2 assassination attempts on his life and did not win him any support. But with Reagan, it does. So he is actually shot 69 days into his presidency by a man named John Hinckley. Now, Hinckley is actually still alive today and has been released from a mental institution. But Hinckley decided he desperately needed to kill the president because he was obsessed with Jodie Foster. Jodie Foster is an actress, right? She was in Silence of the Lambs, which is great. And she was in Taxi Driver, which is a really good, but really dark film. In Taxi Driver, she plays a 12-year-old prostitute. And Hinckley saw this film over 15 times in the theater, and Hinckley fell madly in love with Miss 12-year-old prostitute Jodie Foster and became obsessed with her. Hinckley identified with one of the main guys named Bickle, who was protecting Jodie Foster throughout the film, and towards the end of the film, Bickle attempts to assassinate a U.S. senator who was running for president, so that's where he gets the idea. But basically, in the aftermath of Taxi Driver, he begins stalking Jodie Foster, so following her throughout the country. He ends up following her to Princeton and sitting in the back of her classes, and it's repeatedly calling her and sending her all these letters and stuff. Super creepy, super stalker. And he finally decides that the only way to ever gain Jodie Foster's admiration and love is by killing the President of the United States, because that will then put him in the public eye and make him her equal. So killing the president will make Jodie Foster fall in love with him. Now, he actually was first going to kill Carter because it didn't matter who. It was just the president, right? It didn't matter what their political views were. And he gets within a couple feet of Carter, but he ends up getting arrested for possession of an illegal handgun before he's able to kill him. So then he sets his sights on Reagan and ends up shooting Reagan twice, once in the arm and once in the chest. And Reagan suffered a punctured lung and heavy internal bleeding, and people weren't sure immediately if he was going to make it, but they whisk him off, and he recovers very well and very quickly, and this is people are going to rally around him. He was already really popular, and now it's oh my God, you got shot by this maniac, that's terrible. And he later tells his wife things honey, I forgot to duck, and his popularity soars. People are oh my God, that's so great. So again, very popular president. Now, his economic policies are not quite as on board. So despite all his popularity, his economic policies ultimately have very disastrous consequences for the average American. Now, Reagan blamed inflation on high federal spending and excessive taxation. And in an attempt to to sort of combat these things, he needs to cut a lot of things down. Now, cutting back federal spending and cutting taxes together isn't necessarily, like, that's not necessarily a bad idea. It's the way that he does it, right? So if you give people tax cuts, that means you're making less money as the government. And so if you're cutting back government spending as well, right, that's a good combination. What you don't want to do is cut taxes and spend more money, right, because then you're increasing your spending and you don't have as much revenue. But cutting taxes puts more money in the pockets of the American people, right? If they're making more money every month, they're more likely to buy things, which is supposed to stimulate the economy and all of that. So that's not necessarily a bad tactic. The problem is how Reagan executes this. So his initial economic policy will become known as supply-side economics, or more frequently as trickle-down economics, right? The idea that you give tax cuts to the wealthiest portion of the population, and that money will then trickle down through American society through job growth. So essentially, the theory is that if the private sector, right, private companies are freed from taxes, they will have more money, and therefore they will expand their companies and they will produce more goods and services. And as they're expanding their company, that's going to mean more jobs. And if there's more jobs, that's more Americans working, and that's more money in the pockets of American people, and that's growing the economy, right? So you give big businesses tax cuts, and you give the wealthiest portion of American tax cuts, and that money will then trickle down to everyone else. His tax cut will be called the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, which is this whole process. Now, the problem is this ends up making the tax structure much less progressive and ends up reducing the tax rate of the highest individual incomes rather than for the average American. So this does not work, right? The average person ends up paying more in taxes or the same amount in taxes thanks to a combination of inflation and whatnot, something called bracket creeping, which is basically with inflation, you're pushed into a higher bracket even though your money isn't a tax bracket, even though your money isn't actually worth that much. Anyways, the point, though, is the wealthiest Americans get tax cuts, and this does not affect or doesn't benefit the lower or middle classes very much at all, right? So even though, yes, we were going to do these big tax cuts, it's not actually putting more money into the pockets of the American people, just the wealthiest people who already had money in their pockets. So this doesn't stimulate the economy in the way that it was designed to, right? So that doesn't work. Additionally, we're not seeing that massive business growth, and so this is not beneficial for Americans as a whole, unfortunately, which is, not great. So again, it's the way that he implemented it, not the actual idea behind it. So not good job. So remember, also when you cut taxes, right, suddenly that means the government is making less money. So essentially you have to find a way to pay for that. And so with cutting taxes, he's also going to cut down on government spending. Right? So he's cutting the budgets. The problem is one of the biggest budgets he's cutting is the budget for regulatory agencies. Now, regulatory agencies are agencies that enforce the law, right? So an environmental regulatory agency could be like, let's not put toxic waste in drinking water, right? And so they go around and they make sure that people aren't putting toxic waste in drinking water, and then if they are, punishing them for it, right? Because they broke the law. So those are the type of agencies that we are cutting funding to. We're deregulating things. We're cutting funding to the agencies that actually enforce the law, which is not good. Reagan will also begin deregulating industry in terms of, the preventions that we had in place for monopolies. Now, Carter, again, had started this. This was Carter's sort of brainchild, but Reagan is going to continue it. And so we're going to see more and more deregulation of industry across the board. And again, regulation is tricky because you don't want too much, but you don't want too little. But it definitely seems like, right, we don't want monopolies in place because monopolies don't allow for capitalism to take place, right? You need to foster competition. And monopolies don't allow for competition, so monopolies aren't really capitalism. But that's the direction we're heading. With the deregulation of the economy in this way, right, we're allowing for monopolies to take hold, and then that sort of that makes it not capitalism. And then he also moves to lift environmental restrictions. So we will open up huge amounts of federal land to coal and timber production, halt the growth of the national park land. Sorry. I'm tired. And open up over 1 billion acres of land to offshore drilling. So that's going to be happening as well. In order to find ways to save money, he's also going to create something called the Grace Commission. So the Grace Commission, its purpose was to root out inefficiency, right? To find ways where the government was spending too much money and cut it. And one of the things that the Grace Commission discovers is that the government could save over $400 billion over a 3-year period if they made it harder for people to qualify for welfare, pensions, and other benefits. Now, to be fair, Social Security and things like that, right, that is the largest portion of America's budget, larger than the military, right? That's where we spend most of our money, is on things like Social Security. And so that seems, it's not like it's just, we're just picking on it and it's only like 10% of the budget. It is the largest part, but we are going to see some pretty serious cuts to it. So they are going to, the way that they, can save money is by making it harder for people to qualify. And so you can do this in multiple ways. Some, and this is for welfare or pension or disability or things like that. So one of the ways that you can do this is by increasing the age limit, right? So like instead of having to be 65 to qualify for, your pension, you have to be 67, right? So it's just adding a couple more years. Other ways that we do this is like dropping the line lower and lower. So you have to make less, rather than making less than $18,000 a year, right? You have to make less than $16,000 a year to qualify for certain things. And so that's ultimately kind of going to hurt people a lot as well. The Grace Commission also recommends something called a line item veto. Thankfully, this doesn't go through and Congress does not like this. But a line item veto is basically where the president, like when Congress pushes through a bill or the federal budget, right? When they're like, here's our budget for the year. Reagan could just like cross out anything that he didn't like and then sign it into law without having to have it reapproved by Congress, which would have given the president incredible amounts of power. But Congress does not agree, and so that does not really work. So part of why Reagan is going to get a lot of this welfare stuff pushed through is because we're going to see some initial job growth. And so with that initial job growth, he's sort of like, look, more jobs, everything's better. We don't need this anymore, right? We don't need to have this in place, even though, of course, it's all going to be temporary. Yeah, so, okay. So, jobs. In the early years of Reagan's presidency, we actually see the country falling into a recession, right? Reagan isn't necessarily responsible for this, right? He's taking over in the fall of 81. It's not like that's all his fault. He has barely been president. But it's definitely affecting Americans. And so it takes a few years for Reaganomics to work. So those first few years are actually not great for the economy. The Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, raises interest rates. That's going to slow the economy. Unemployment is going to increase. And we're seeing Reaganomics not sort of work initially. But by spring of 1984, we're seeing the effects of some of this start to kick in. So by spring of 84, the recession has ended. Job availability is increasing. The economy is on the upswing. We have much less unemployment. And supporters give Reagan credit for this, right? And there's some validity to that because with opening up, offshore drilling, with opening up more timber and coal industries and things like that, Reagan was creating jobs. More jobs were being created. The problem is this solution as a whole was a short-term solution. So his critics here have a very valid point, right? That Reaganomics caused a temporary boom, right? Or possibly issues with the deficit too. But we see this temporary boom being caused with an increase in the war industry and an increase in jobs and all of this because we're going to get back in the Cold War. But long term, this would have some very serious issues and really hurt the economy, which is pretty true. But 1984 is another important year because it is an election year. So by spring of 84, the recession is ending. There's a bunch of jobs. Unemployment is high. People, again, are looking to Reagan and are going to reelect him partially because of that. So they go, awesome, you solved everything. Yes, we want you to be president again. And so we see an overwhelming victory in 1984 when Reagan beats Mondale. This will help him win the election, right? So this election pits very popular Republican incumbent Ronald Reagan versus the Democratic candidate Walter Mondale. Mondale fails to inspire the American people, and so he only manages to win his home state of Minnesota and then the District of Columbia. Mondale is actually the first nominee to choose, or one of the first nominees to choose a female vice president as a running mate, Geraldine Ferraro. But he runs a campaign that isn't going to go over great. So one of the big campaign promises that he makes is that he would actually raise taxes. So that doesn't go over well. Even if you're going to raise taxes, you don't want to run on, hey, everybody, I'm going to raise your taxes and take more money from you. That is not a popular stance. So that's not great. Mondale will also accuse Reagan of some very real things, but it doesn't go over well with the American public. So he accuses Reagan of helping the rich at the expense of the poor. He accuses Reagan of saddling future generations with huge deficits and huge debts, and of risking war in the Middle East and in Central America. All of those are very valid criticisms, but he comes off more as like whiny and obnoxious than anything else. And so this will be one of the biggest landslide victories in American history. Or modern American history, because obviously, like Washington and Monroe and stuff. Okay, so by the mid-1980s, the problem of the growing deficit is becoming very important. So a deficit, right, is how much the American government as a whole owes, right? How much money are we in debt? The deficit is total. So so the total, how much money do we owe? Okay, so there's a couple factors that's going to lead into this. So first, we're seeing, right, the economy is kind of weakened, which means that an unemployment is going to increase. And unemployment increasing means that the government is spending more on unemployment, right? So with the economy not doing well, as it sort of like wavers back and forth, more people are out of work. And when more people are out of work, they apply for unemployment insurance. And when they apply for that, the government has to pay for that. So then the government's spending more money. And then additionally, we are spending enormous amounts on the military. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture. We see an increase we're sort of ramping up the Cold War again. And so we're spending on that as well. The deficit is going to reach $207.8 billion in 1983, which is almost triple the $70 billion high in 1976 that we had criticized Carter for. Congress, both the Republicans and the Democrats, basically look at this and they're like, okay, we need to change something. So they came forward with a solution. And this would be a series of budget ceilings designed to get rid of the deficit by 1991. However, the Supreme Court ruled that some of the features would actually be unconstitutional, so they revised them. And what ends up getting passed is the Graham-Rudman Act. The Graham-Rudman Act moved the goal of ending the deficit up to 93 and does several things. The compromise here is, so what the Graham-Rudman Act kind of says is Reagan is going to cut back on military increases, right? So we're going to decrease our military spending. And the Democrats give up their hope of expanding social programs, right, including in a comprehensive national health plan. So we had been playing around with making universal health care in the 80s. But the Democrats say, okay, that's too expensive. We will give up on that plan. And Reagan will say, okay, that's fair. I'm spending too much on the military. I will cut back on that as well. So we do see a bipartisan support for the Graham-Rudman Act. So that's a way to sort of counteract this. But we're seeing, Americans are really kind of still struggling, right, with the high price of luxury too. Essentially we're also seeing the American people sending a lot of money overseas just in interest for things that they're buying because they want all the nicest stuff, right? And so we're spending a lot of money as a whole, as a country. Now, the success of Reaganomics, again, is short-lived. So by 1987, we're going to see a massive stock market crash. November 19th, we have $500 billion lost in a single day. This is the greatest one-day crash in U.S. history. But this isn't going to translate into something like the Great Depression, again, because of some of the safeguards we have in place. So some of this was the fact that we had new technology. There was sort of this investing frenzy and a euphoria of like, oh my God, everything's going so well. We're doing so well. But it's a bubble, right? So it bursts, which is going to lead, of course, normally like normal to psychological panic. It doesn't go well. But we don't see a depression the way that we did after, the great crash of 1929 for a variety of things. One, the Fed counters this by lowering interest rates, so it's going to be cheaper to get loans. And wealthy people sort of look at this and they start buying up the undervalued stocks, which is going to help this rise again. And we do have safeguards in place, right? We have things like the FDIC. We have Social Security stuff in place. So it does not cause a massive depression. But all in all, a lot of the results of the Reagan-era economy, we're going to see a shift in the economy as a whole. So we are going to see unemployment go back up again in the late employment go back up again in the late 90s. And by 1990, we have about 19 million more Americans working than they did in 1980. But we're seeing a shift in labor, and that's really important. So blue-collar jobs begin to decline, right? Either the industries had closed or they had moved abroad for cheaper labor, right? But that's a very similar trend as, this is a continuation of the trend that we were looking at the beginning of the lecture with the move from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. And now more and more companies are going overseas. And so we're seeing those blue-collar jobs go with them. But where we are seeing growth is in the service sector. So the service sector is expanding rapidly. Now, service sector is, being working in finance or transportation or healthcare industries or doing something where you're not creating a product, but you're providing a service, right? That could be waitressing. That could be teaching. That could be being a nurse, right? That could be being a tax consultant. All of those, you're not producing an actual product, you're providing a service for people. So we're seeing a rise in the service sector. But the biggest overarching trend here is the growth of wealth inequality. So even though we're seeing more Americans working, we're not seeing a rise of the middle class. A lot of those jobs are still very low-paying jobs. And so the rich continue to get richer by the end of this, and this is the trend that we're still seeing today, right? Whereas the poor are getting poorer, and we're going to see the start of a shrinking of the middle class, and that's the new trend, right? It's harder to remain in the middle class because the wealthier are getting increasingly wealthier, and particularly with the deregulation and the allowing for corporate mergers and the developing monopolies, we're going to see that wealth continue to grow, whereas the middle class is struggling to remain in existence. So thanks, Reagan. Long-term consequences for us here that we're still dealing with, but that's Reaganomics.